Janessa is my guest today, and so I'm not going to waste any more time. I mean, she's delightful, and she's got so much to share with us. But I'm going to hand over. Janessa, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Janessa Finley Ford, and I am an empowerment coach by day. I have really lived much of an unconventional life in all of the ways, and I find it to be most fulfilling. But my background, I would say, is not the average story that you hear of most people. I grew up on a farm. I was the fifth generation to live in our family's farmstead. My brother and I were the last generation on that farm built by my great great grandparents. We went to a one-room country school. That's where I started my education. And then I went from the sticks of the country into the prison system was my first job in my career out of college. And then I worked probation, drug court, and for the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States for a total of about 20 years. And so quite the contrast between corn and cows to prison systems,
Absolutely.
probation, and supervising felons.
Yeah, because I mentioned, yeah, very, very, very different, as you say, living in the sticks but on a farm, and then
Yes.
into that a very different world. So you wouldn't
Yeah.
even experience, I imagine, very much of the sharp end of society until you got into the prison system.
For sure. We grew up in an area where you could just leave your doors unlocked.
Mm.
People never, like, crime wasn't really a thing. So very, very opposing lifestyles and cultures in many ways. And along the way, I felt that pull, that draw for more. And I've always loved just helping people. Even within the system, I felt like I was helping people with the jobs that I did have. I started in the prison and I was even on the tactical team for a little while, but I didn't stay there really long. And then when I went into probation and drug court, really helping people with underlying addiction issues. And I just I wanted more impact. I knew I had more within me and I didn't know what that more looked like, but through a series of unexpected events, I was led into this world of energy psychology and I became a practitioner and a coach. And so while I was working for the Department of Homeland Security, I was able to also, in addition, start a business. And so I coached and did that for many, many years until I transitioned into coaching all the time.
That's one transition, one
Yeah.
big transition. And what was that like moving through those different um, career changes, being involved in those situations? Because, yeah, what did it feel like for you?
You it was really a coming home of my to myself, honestly. Having started with prison and probation, and with probation, I had some unusual experiences you wouldn't necessarily have as well. I served a no-knock search warrant with ATF, and I've worked with a confidential human source with the FBI. Some situations where we're serving one warrant, we thought we were shot at on the street, and you're so programmed to not respond. You're so tactical and you're so strategic, and you can't get caught up in the trauma of whatever may be happening. You're just calculated. And as I became more of a human and less of a calculated, programmed person, truly all of it was just following my nudges. Like I explained, even getting into energy psychology was just some random, suggestion of someone I knew, like, hey, you might be interested in going to this course before I went to the actual training. I had a couple people interested in experiencing it, and I hadn't even trained in it yet. And they're like, no, no, it's fine. It's fine. I trust you, whatever. And they had amazing results from it. And so then I realized there's something more here than meets the eye. And I just kept very disciplined, like the criminal justice trained you to be, but I was very disciplined in following that intuition and those nudges and
Ah,
where the breadcrumbs of life was leading me. And coming home to myself is truly is no greater way of explaining the pivots and transitions from where I began in my career to where I am now.
yeah, that's some huge change. You know, as you say, you were very tactical and disciplined and trained not to get involved. And then I think with what you're doing now, yeah, you're involved. It's
Yeah.
so different. We are, because I'm a counselor and psychotherapist, and therefore you. Although I always say I'm not going to get on that muddy path with you, I need to get as close as I can without being in the mud. But it is we are very much our emotions are so involved in it. We can't get away from that.
Yeah. Coming alongside people looks so much different doing what I do now versus, don't let anyone know anything about any of your personal details, where you live, all
Mm.
of that stuff. And I I had one situation with a probationer who saw me while I was off work in street clothes. I was sick actually at the pharmacy and I was getting a prescription. This was so many years ago. And they walked up behind me. And then when they violated probation, they threatened me because they said, I know where you live. I'm going to send someone over there. I saw you, at the pharmacy and I have your personal information, which who knows if that was true or just, threats. But it truly is a whole different world of
Yeah,
relationships and getting to be so real with people
yeah.
and to do the raw and the real of life. And I I freaking love that because it was not a part of who I could be or how I could connect with people for so long through my
Mm.
career. And
Yeah,
as much as I would love to say that didn't translate into my personal life, I think both from my own experiences and traumas that I carried, as well as how I was trained to
hmm,
be in my career, it also translated into my personal relationships as well. So everything's so much more fulfilling. Of course, this is why I focus on relationships and allowing other people to discover their own, relationships that are supportive and fulfilling and
yeah.
everything their heart desires. We feel, I meet so many people who believe sacrifice is a partnerships, and it's just a thought process and a belief system I would love to implode because I don't believe that it truly has to be sacrificed. We have choices.
Tell me more about that.
Well, when we're standing in our own power and we make a choice, our choice has there's causes and effect, right? Like there's
Yeah,
effect to our choices. There's naturally occurring consequences, if you'd like to use that terminology. But there doesn't have to be sacrifice. In so many relationships, and this is outside of interpersonal relationships, this is our relationship with time, with money, like
yeah.
relationships by and large. We fall into an either or mindset. We can either
Mm.
have this or we can have that. And that paints the illusion of sacrifice.
Yeah,
When we approach life with an and both perspective, we can have our relationship and still fulfill ourselves. There is no loss, there's no sacrifice. We're doing what we need to do in the moment to invest in ourselves, our relationship, our children, whatever the top priority is. And if you're living by your priorities, there's never any sacrifice.
mm, mm. Yeah. I think that's really useful because I think that's it. People do see that either or. And I think that really comes into very much into personal relationships and those couple relationships, those romantic relationships. It can feel very much, I'm sure, in the work that you do, and certainly in the work I do, that it is either or. And it is that word sacrifice seems to come up. Maybe not exact words, but it does feel that way. And that just that constant pull me, push you kind of tug of war that goes on. And it's so sad, I think, because what I see, and it's very, very common that I see, maybe it's something you see, but it is um, that power struggle that goes on. But you're not listening to me, but you're not listening to me, and you're not listening to me, and I'm not important, and you're more important. All of those things that seem to go on, although they may not be voiced in that way, because they're usually the trivia that comes up. The arguments are, well, you never put the bin out, you never clear up behind yourself, you never cook dinner, you never, and it, which is a huge exaggeration normally, because sometimes it is sometimes, but it's that feeling of sacrifice. Well, I do it all and you do nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very common in relationships. I feel as though I am a walking, living example of the exact opposite because
Okay.
in my unconventional life, I chose to marry a felon. While engaged, we experienced an unexpected investigation. It's a very, very long story. I've blogged about it if people want to know more, but I immediately believed that he was guilty because of my background, because of my
Yeah.
career.
Yeah.
And it was actually going through the process of the conflict and the conflict in our relationship for sure.
Mm.
And the investigation and looking at the case, being called as a witness against him because we weren't married at the time. We experienced so much hardship and trauma with this situation. And unfortunately, he was sentenced to prison. And so many would look at my situation and say, like, I've made such a huge sacrifice to be in this relationship. While he has been imprisoned, I'm taking care of, our responsibilities in our life. And I'm sacrificing all of this time that we have apart. And I don't feel that way. It truly is built from a belief system. I
Mm-hmm.
don't believe there's any loss. And so I can't, based upon like my values and virtues, be in alignment that I'm losing anything. I believe that we can be apart and still have a fulfilling relationship. I believe that the people that we are going to evolve into during this time, when we're together again, is going to be even more connected and powerful and have an even more meaningful relationship. There's so many things we will not take for granted, such as the ability to pick up the phone and call him, you know? And it's all of this perspective. Are you building your relationship upon a belief system and a perspective
Yeah.
that's going to bring you closer together and unite you? Or are you building your relationship on belief systems such as sacrifice that is going to wedge and divide and
Mm.
separate you?
Exactly. So how did you overcome that? Because I imagine that you said there was so much conflict going on. So how did you navigate your way through that?
Very intentionally and with a lot of honestly personal growth work, healing work, whatever that is to each individual person. Um, my partner probably would not call it healing, but he certainly embraced much more of a spiritual avenue, pathway, journey in his life than what he had previously. And with that, I believe that when we open to spirit, a lot of healing happens. And so, in whatever avenue you get there in your healing and your personal development work, it truly was deconstruction and reconstruction, both of my own personal belief system. Like I said, initially, I assumed he was guilty. The whole premise that you're innocent until proven guilty, that did not exist here. Not in our household, not in our relationship, not even when I had known him for almost 5 years. We had been together and we were engaged for 6 months prior to the beginning of everything. All of that went out the window. Everything that I had known with the man that I had lived with, I was like, oh, well, I mean, if the FBI is showing up, clearly you did something. And so we were very very intentional of, this probably sounds a little bit backward, of our own personal needs. Because when you're that, like, there was national news media coverage, campaign, like there were so many traumas along the way. His financial everything was shut off. Um, really fast deadlines, 3 days to find an attorney, to retain an attorney and respond, less than 24 hours to decide whether or not he's taking a plea agreement. So a lot of blindsiding and a lot of trauma.
So did
In
that,
a,
you
in,
said that you felt that the premise was you believed he was guilty. So how did that impact your relationship? The conversations, the kind of that there must have been conflict because you're going to question it. You're going to be, I mean, where does the trust come from?
well, there wasn't much. There wasn't
No.
much trust in the beginning at all. And it was through the deconstruction and reconstruction. And also when I was called as a witness, then I went into officer investigator mode. And I was not going to go be a witness not knowing much of, I looked at everything that I could get my hands on in the case objectively to see where the evidence took me. And it was in that, as well as the experience that I had in the interview, where I realized a lot of my beliefs around how the justice system reached a conviction wasn't actually what I thought it was. And as I shared, my career was on the back end of the justice system. And so I would say the trust was a reflection that dishonesty for 4.5 years had not been a part of our relationship. It,
Uh,
he is a pretty honest man. And even if I'm a sensitive type of individual. So even if something that he shared honestly stung or hurt or gave me pause, he would still share it. And so there was that seed of trust in reflecting over the past history. This is the behavior I saw that got us to here. But the most compelling part of the trust came when I started looking at the evidence. And then what I saw in the physical, coupled with the past 4.5 years, what I saw in him, coupled with, they say that when you go through these really stressful situations, you see the most real part of someone magnified. And what I was witnessing was someone who was grateful. When he lost his job, he was so grateful. He had the opportunity to work there. He loved the job. He loved the people. And I wasn't grateful. I was anything but grateful of having that level of security taken from our lives. But he was grateful. He was kind. He was gracious. And as I saw what was coming out in him in this incredibly pressure cooker type atmosphere and having, for sure, his life turned upside down, mine too in many ways, but it obviously affects him a little more than it did me. I wasn't the one being printed in the press and all of the media. I saw the core of his being, and it was
yeah.
so counter to what was being claimed that he did. But honestly, at the end of the day, like I also had to go through all of, could I marry a felon? Because if you'd asked me that 2 years ago, I would have said absolutely never under no circumstances. The relationship would have just been over and I would have walked away. So I had a lot to sort through within my own inner beliefs. And this was a big part of working through the conflict too. Because when I was not in conflict with myself over the situation, when I wasn't like, part of me wants to marry him and part of me wants to bounce because it's messy. When I was completely aligned with, okay, my belief system is that as humans, we make mistakes.
Yeah.
And perhaps there is a mistake that would be a deal breaker. This one isn't it. So then if we're learning what we need to learn from every situation that we face in life, whether it's an investigation or stubbing your toe on a sidewalk, something very minuscule,
Mm-hmm.
then I will walk with this person through this fire. And so there was so much of this inner work that translated to being so supportive of the relationship and what we were going through. And the less inner conflict I had, the less inner conflict he had, the less conflict our relationship had.
Well, I'm hearing some really lovely things in here. I'm hearing some things that could be so useful to others, because when I talk about people where they argue about who did what, you haven't done this. I mean, underneath it is, that's not the real story. It's, I don't matter. You've abandoned me. You don't respect me. And yet, what I've heard from you, although we haven't heard this, but my sense is there was a real sense of openness, a real sense of honesty, a real sense of self kind of, yeah, the inner work. I want to say that, but I want to put it a different way. There was, it's this, is this me, or is this him, or is it me? And it's more about being able to step back, which you've been able to do, and have honest conversations and hear those honest conversations, which I think is really good. So many people feel in relationships that when there's an honesty, it's directed at them rather than this is what the person who's telling me feels. They feel it's a projection onto them, whereas often it isn't. But you've, many couples that come to me aren't able to acknowledge that, but you two have managed to work through that. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Really, I feel like one of the biggest aspects of this kind of thread of what we're talking about is assigning meaning rather than blame. You know,
Yeah.
like you said, there's nothing surface level that many couples argue about that's really the problem at hand. Like who's bathing the children or taking out the trash, or like
Yeah.
that's just kind of pointing the finger in very surface level and diving deeper below the blame of how we got here, because at the end of the day, the how in our situation, the how we got here was such a perfect storm of so many different factors that it was a real waste of energy.
Mm.
And so I started looking at the meaning. What can I learn from this situation? I again, my spiritual belief system, nothing in life is coincidence. Things don't happen by chance. So I'm here very purposefully. What is it that I then have to learn? Because if I didn't have something to learn from this situation, I wouldn't be here. And second of all, I don't ever, ever want to face a similar situation because I missed the learning the first time. And so I really focused on what is the meaning of this? How can I grow? What can I learn from this? And what purpose does this really have? Because I do believe that from pain, our greatest purposes can be birthed if we allow it to be a portal of opportunity and not a place of pain and hurt where we get stuck.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think such wise words, because so many people take the other route and they just aren't able to go down that level and actually learn what's really going on and what do I need to learn from this. They get stuck at the, it's almost like their fingers stuck on the button of blame and they can't move past it, and they can't get past what is the meaning of this, what does this really mean to us. And I mean, that's the work I do with couples, but they haven't got that ability to get past that. I think they're so protective of themselves, they are unable to bring those barriers down.
Yeah, and emotions too. I'm
Yeah.
not to point the finger at one aspect, but it is so hard to have an objective point of view or to critically think when we're swept up in emotions. And
Oh
how
yeah.
many emotions do we feel as humans when we interact with our partners, when we're hurt, when these triggers keep getting triggered? Like, let it be an activation rather than a trigger. What does that activate you to resolve in your relationship within yourself, rather than sitting in that trigger, in that emotional tornado, if you will? And that too was such an enormous part of our ability to traverse the conflict last year, because there was so much trauma. Thank heavens that I had the background I had, that I had moved into the world of energy psychology, regulating the nervous system, having tools that
Yeah.
the average person doesn't have to process emotions, which I think should be taught in school. And it's beyond myself why these things about how can we be the best humans that we can be are completely left out of all curriculum. It's a whole nother conversation for another day. But
It
if you don't
is.
have these tools, they're so important, not just
Yeah.
for your relationship with other people, but for your relationship for yourself. Because when
Yeah.
you're caught up in your emotions, we often do things impulsively, or we do things that we wouldn't normally do. We
Mm.
can't think rationally. We can't
Yeah.
problem solve. We don't get to a place of resolution because we're busy feeling angry, feeling betrayed,
Yeah.
and that's part of being human. So we have to embrace our humanness
Mhm.
and have that wisdom and knowledge and tools to understand, what does human nature, what are the trends? How does that work? And
Yeah.
thoughts precede emotions, but I'm so in my emotions, I can't think straight.
Yeah. And you're so right. That is it. When our nervous system is dysregulated, we can't think rationally. There's no way. And that's what, when, as you say, we just kind of go for it, and or we're triggered and it's bleh, and we react in the same way that we did when we were very young and triggered. So yeah, it's very much that, and that learning that is so important. And you're right. If only it was taught. I wish I'd been taught that a long time ago. For
Yeah,
sure.
that is exactly how I felt when it came into my world. I'm like, where has this been all my life? But
Yeah,
better now than never.
absolutely. Yeah. Ah, what is one thing that you would like the audience to take away? I mean, you've offered so much already, but is there one thing that you could suggest that people take with them?
I I think my biggest hope from people hearing even a tidbit of my story is understanding that relationships are the greatest opportunity for our own personal development, for our own healing, for our own growth. Like I said earlier, like whatever that is to every person.
Mhm.
Um, I feel like relationships get a bad reputation,
Mhm.
and they have, the connotation that it's a ball and chain, it ties you down, you're going to be scarred for life, you carry the hurt and pain, yada, yada, yada. Like so many really unsupportive belief systems get wrapped up in our relationships, from a cultural place, from an environmental place, from people observing what their parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles demonstrated in relationships. And that used to be my story too, if I'm being honest. I was married at 21, divorced at 22, and it took me almost 2 decades to remarry. And it was last year's situation, this whole investigation, where I finally rewrote that story and fully lived the fact that the relationships and honor opportunity for my own healing, for my own growth, and not like I could have stayed in this relationship and been forever wounded,
Yeah.
but that was not going to be my reality. And we both vowed to be better, not bitter. So I think for, if nothing else, for people to embrace the viewpoint, the perspective, the truth that whatever you're experiencing in your relationship is an opportunity, it's not a burden.
That's great advice, such wise words. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I will put all your details in the show notes so that people can get in touch with you. But one easy way,
Yeah, check out my website, www.fiercelyradiantsoul.com, and you can
Brilliant.
find me there.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank you.
so
And
much today for um, sharing how much you have. It's been so interesting. I could talk to you for ages, but thank you so much for your time today.
thank you for the conversation.